Good evening. We're a small but intimate crowd today, but I'm nevertheless very pleased that you're here, and I want to welcome you very warmly. My name is Carl Hutter. I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. And I'm welcoming you to tonight's program, which is entitled The World of John James Audubon, Revealed in Art, Letters, and Diaries. Program which deals with the life of one of the most remarkable wildlife artists and original Americans ever. It is presented by Dr. Richard Johnson, portraying John James Audubon, and Dr. Yoke Johnson, portraying his wife Lucy. Now, before I introduce the program itself, a couple of notes in advance. One is, for those of you who have not seen the current exhibit in the John and Peggy Maximus Gallery, I would very much like to invite you to do so. It will be open for one more week before it closes for installation of a new exhibit. This exhibit that is currently still on show is entitled Origins of Scientific Illustration, Basilius Bessler to John James Audubon. There's another very pleasant duty I have before I introduce the program, and this has to do with a man by the name of Alexander Wilson. Surely John James Audubon is America's most famous, most celebrated, most outstanding wildlife artist. But he had a predecessor, and a man who, in some respect, was an inspiration for Audubon. His name is Alexander Wilson. Alexander Wilson was a Scottish immigrant, an itinerant poet, peddler of muslin, and he was eventually to become a friend of Thomas Jefferson's and a number of other illustrious people in the United States. But his lasting fame and his lasting accomplishment is in the fact that he became the father of American ornithology. He published a 9-volume work entitled American Ornithology, published between 1808 and 1814, a work that contained his own studies, his own texts, and also his own illustrations, his engravings. There are a number of stories. Wilson was older than Audubon, but they did meet. A number of stories about the meeting in Kentucky, where Audubon had a general store, and it said that Wilson and Audubon went out shooting together. Audubon, by this time, had already accumulated a fair store of his own bird illustrations. These illustrations, however, he had not conceived yet of the publication of this great encyclopedic work on American birds. And also he had not really at that point reached the height of his artistic endeavors. But Wilson's own publication, his book on American ornithology, almost certainly was an inspiration for Audubon, and Wilson at that time was, of course, considered the master of the art. Now, the connection is that today is John James Audubon's 216th birthday. And we have a birthday present, which is presented to us, to the museum, by John and Peggy Maximus. And I'm so pleased to see that Peggy Maximus herself is here tonight. She is the patron of the John and Peggy Maximus Gallery, which is also endowed with a wonderful collection of antique natural history art, and continues to get support from Peggy Maximus, for which we're very deeply grateful. And we're very honored to have her with us tonight. The picture you see at the entrance, it's by Alexander Wilson. It's called Ruffed Spring Grouse. And I all hope you will see it. You will have a look at it. We are very pleased to accept this wonderful presence into our collection. into the Maximus collection of art, and will treasure it forever. It is certainly one of the great, Alexander Wilson was certainly one of the great naturalists and illustrators in this wonderful tradition that Audubon so admirably exemplifies. Now, to celebrate the gift, we will have also a birthday cake. You might have seen it when you come in, and after the program is complete, we'll slice it up, and each one of you can have a piece of birthday cake, and we all invite you to stay for that. Now to the actual program. One of our presenters this evening, Dr. Richard Johnson, is a professor of history at California State University, Pomona, where he specializes in 19th century American history. He has a PhD from Claremont Graduate University, and besides all of the responsibilities that go along with his job, teaching, publishing, and all, he has performed in several Chautauquas throughout the United States, portraying such characters as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Abraham Lincoln, John Dos Passos, Alexis de Tocqueville, and also Audubon. Our other presenter tonight is Dr. Yoke Johnson, who is Assistant Dean of Faculty at Claremont McKenna College. She holds a PhD in government from Claremont Graduate University and a JD from the Free University of Amsterdam in her native country, the Netherlands. Tonight, we'll be learning not so much about identifying birds or other animals, but we will be hearing and learning about, well, we'll be opening a window into the life of a very gifted artist and naturalist. We'll be getting a glimpse into his world, hearing about his efforts, his frustrations, his challenges, and the passion of his work. And we'll see all of this through his relationship with his wife, Lucy. It is a human experience, a deeply human experience, a touching experience, living history. That is what we will be hearing about tonight. And tonight, Audubon and his wife, Lucy, are in his studio in the late 1840s. And now, please, join me in welcoming John and Lucy Audubon.
Thank you, thank you. Welcome to my studio. So wonderful of you to come. And thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I've enjoyed so much hearing the name of Alexander Wilson. It brought to mind all kinds of stories that I'd like to tell you a little bit later. There's only one correction I'd like to make to the introduction. Tonight I'm 61 years old. The year is 1846. This is my studio, which we built 5 years ago when we moved to Minnie's land, 30 acres, which we purchased on the Upper Manhattan, overlooking the Hudson River. Don't you like it? It's wonderful. 216 years. You know, I would love to live that long, to be able to see all of the birds of America and all of the other animals as well. But I might be asking for too much. At any rate, I'm glad that you're here. Lucy and the birds are my two great loves. And I must tell you that one of them is available tonight for $100. That's right, the birds. It is the Royal Octavo edition, finished just 2 years ago. You probably know that when we made the double elephant folio edition, the large ones that you see here, perfectly in life size, that we ended up with 465 copperplate engravings. The entire amount sold for $1,000 to each subscriber. And many people, such as yourselves, came to me and said, "We can't afford such a high price, but we love your birds. Could you not reduce them in size and make them available at a lesser cost?" And now they are, for you, for $100. When you leave tonight, look at the table and see if you can't find a copy of the Royal Octavo edition for $100. A greater bargain you will never find. Well, I'm so glad Lucy is here with me tonight. Normally, she does not accompany me into the studio. This is almost my private place where I not only paint, but I reminisce as well. But tonight is a special night because we have a chance to tell you something about ourselves. I came to America at the age of 18. My father, a French sea captain, wished to get me away from France at just a time when Napoleon was drafting many young men to fight in his wars. And so he sent me to a piece of property he had purchased about 20 miles north of Philadelphia. The name of the property was Mill Grove. And I spent several years there in Mill Grove acquainting myself with the birds that were present in that area. You see, ever since I was a boy, I've had an astonishing desire to see much of the world, and in particular, to gain a knowledge of the birds of America. So when I came to Mill Grove, I did exactly what I wanted to do. I rose before the sun, I went out in the woods, I spent my time observing and shooting many birds and other animals. Sometimes I would not return until after the owls had come out late at night. My greatest concern at that time was trying to find a way to draw birds as if they were alive. Many naturalists, many painters before me had made pictures of birds, but they always looked dead, stuffed, and so they were. Those were the models from which the birds were drawn. I wanted to have the birds look exactly like they were flying or diving or whatever it was that they would naturally be doing. I tried many things. First I had 20 different peewees. These are the small flycatchers that I loved. There are many of them around Mill Grove. And I had shot 20 and brought them in and put them on a table and set them all up and tried to arrange them, but they were all dead. There was nothing to be done. So the next thing I did was to get long threads, like to suspend them and see if I could. It didn't work either. Then I tried to make a wire model and showed it to a friend. I asked him, "What do you think of this?" He said, "It looks rather like a dodo." I kicked that aside, and then I didn't do anything for a month. I was just out of my mind. Finally, early one morning, I woke up and I had an idea. Quickly, I went to the stables, saddled my horse, rode the 9 miles to the next village, and then realized I had to wait several hours for the stores to open. Not everyone gets up as early as I do. So I bathed in the river and waited. And then when the store opened, I bought several long pieces of wire, thin wire, brought them back home. My servant asked if I wanted breakfast. "No," I said, "get me my gun." And with the gun, I went out into the woods and shot the first kingfisher I found and brought him back. And I had the wires, and I made very sharp the points. And the first wire I plunged through the body of the kingfisher and secured it to a soft piece of wood. With a second wire, I moved up and looped around the mandible to hold it in place. And then with other pins, I put the feet in place. And then with another wire, I was able to bring it up under the tail and push the tail up just like a kingfisher looked. And there it was, before you in real life, the kingfisher. Oh, I was excited. I immediately began drawing. In fact, I don't think I ate that day. I was busy all the time drawing. This was my first real opportunity to learn how to make the birds look natural. Something else happened during the time I was in Mill Grove. Shortly after I came to Mill Grove, a family moved in next door. I could see them in the distance, about a half a mile from me. And that family was the Bakewells. Now, I heard about them. They were English. I was French. I had nothing to do with English people. You understand that. Our countries are too frequently at war with each other. So when her father called on me, and I happened to be out in the woods as I normally was. He left his card, and it was customary to return the favor and call on him, and I was too busy to do so. So I already had the Bakewells thinking that I was not a particularly good neighbor. I met her father, however, in the woods one day as we both were hunting, and I discovered that he had wonderful hunting dogs, and I became interested in him. He invited me again to come visit, and the next time I did come, and there in the parlor I met Lucy Bakewell. She was 16 years of age at that time, and my heart just stopped. I saw here was a woman, her voice was like a melody to me. And for the very first time, the birds had a rival. And so I began to wonder how I could arrange to marry Lucy Bakewell. Well, it was not easy. Her father thought that I should be able to provide for his daughter. And it's hard to imagine how a man who spends his day hunting in the woods or just sitting quietly observing birds is going to be able to provide sustenance, let alone a living, for a well-bred English woman. And so I had to find a way to convince her father that I was, after all, a reputable person. With the help of my own father, I acquired a business partner, Ferdinand Rosier. And we went traveling about until we saw in Louisville, Kentucky, the opportunity to start a store, a trading store. And so in 1807, we began this store, and it was a success. So in 1808, I came back to Mill Grove, to Lucy Bakewell, to her father, William Bakewell, and we wed. It was also in the month of April, April 5th, 1808. Well, that's partly my side of the story. Perhaps you'd like to hear how Lucy sees the same experience. Lucy, what would you like to say?
I was born in England in January 1787 at the estate of my father in the Derby Dales. And I was 15 years old when I came to America for the first time. At the time, I was not at all sure why my father had decided to move to America. We lived on a beautiful estate and had a very comfortable life. My father was a gentleman farmer who spent most of his time outside with his horses and his dogs. But looking back, I also realized that he was a very unusual person. He loved his estate, but he also had a great interest in philosophy and in science. And he had quite advanced ideas for his times. For example, he wanted to make sure that all of his children, not just his 2 sons, but also his 4 daughters, received the best education possible. After my marriage, there were many times when I was very grateful for the education I received before I came to America. My father first visited America in 1798. At that time, his brother Benjamin was living in New York, and my father was intrigued by the business and new opportunities that his brother kept writing about. So he went to New York, and when he came back the following year, he surprised all of us by saying that he had decided to sell his properties in England and move to America. All the children, the 6 of us, were excited about that. We had received letters from our cousins and were eager to visit all the beautiful sights they were telling us about. But I remember well how sad and reluctant my mother was to leave her home, her country, and her family. Shortly after arriving in New York, we moved to New Haven, Connecticut, where my father and his brother had bought a brewery. My father was a chemist, so he was interested in the new developing breweries in America. And just like in England, I spent as much time as I could outside in the woods. I loved to ride my horses. We had beautiful dogs, and my cousins and other friends who had also come over from England had a wonderful time. It was a great place to be. We lived on a small farm close to my father's business, and we had no worries. But my father soon decided that he really would rather manage an estate and go back to farming instead of always being busy inside with his business, the needs of his business. So within 2 years, he moved us back to Philadelphia and started looking for an estate. He finally bought a great estate about 20 miles north of Philadelphia in the Valley Forge. The previous owner, a Mr. Vaux, called his estate Vaux Hill, but my father quickly renamed it Fatland Ford because he had heard that earlier settlers had found that the soil was so fertile that it reminded them of the fat lands of Egypt. Life at Fatland Ford was really not that different from our life in England. We had a wonderful, spacious house. We had plenty of servants, although in this case most of them were slaves. And soon our neighbors started calling on us, and we became a part of the community. But for me, life at Fatland Ford was quite different. I was no longer 15 and carefree. My mother had been in poor health for several years, and she died within a year after we moved to Pennsylvania. From then on, I, of course, had more responsibility for my younger brothers and sisters, and I also had to support my father. The estate also was much larger than our estate in England and was more isolated. So especially in the beginning, I found it harder to make friends and to go to the village to go shopping. However, all that changed very quickly once I met John James Audubon. I had heard many stories about Audubon before I ever met him. Audubon was our closest neighbor, and my father and brother had met him many times in the woods. Tom, at 15, was full of admiration for then 18-year-old Audubon. We kept hearing stories about Audubon. He had the best horses. He had the best trained dogs of anybody in the district. He could ride harder and faster than anybody. He was a better shooter. He was a better fencer. The stories were never ending. Of course, to me, I was sure that Tom exaggerated a great deal because we also heard many stories about Audubon's clothes. He was from France, and his mother sent him silk ruffled shirts and fancy hats and boots like we had never seen before. I just could not believe that, a dandy like that with long curly hair could also be a great shooter or a great rider. Besides, Audubon had been quite rude to us when he had ignored our invitation to call on us. I first saw John in our beloved woods between the two estates. I was walking quietly when I saw him, standing still as a tree, watching a small bird. I startled the bird out of his hiding place when I accidentally stepped on a twig. As the bird flew away, John looked up. I recognized him right away from Tom's stories. His velvet coat was indeed very different from my father's somewhat slightly worn English tweeds. Shortly thereafter, he called at Fatland Ford. I had never met anybody like him. His eyes were brilliant like an eagle's, and he had more energy than anybody I had ever met. He rose before the sun came up and rarely slept more than 4 hours a night. And I soon found out that even though he dressed extravagantly, he really was quite shy. We shared so many interests. We loved to read together. He helped me with my French. I helped him with his English. We also loved to play music together. But most of all, we used to love to walk and talk in the woods. And soon we both felt sure that we belonged together. And we told my father we wanted to get married. At that time we were 17 and 19. Of course, much too young. My father had always told me that I could choose my own husband and make my own decisions. But of course, he wanted to make sure that I would be well provided for. And at the time, he undoubtedly considered John very immature and very irresponsible. And he would not hear about a marriage until John could show that he could provide for a family in the way that I was accustomed to. Now, I have to tell you that at the time, we all assumed that John and his father were well-to-do, and that in the future, John would inherit the estate and his father's fortune. Life held many surprises for us that we did not know about. And like my father, John's father was not willing to support a marriage, although for different reasons. Of course, for one thing, he was the former French sea captain, and he had a deep distrust of the English. So finally, John decided that he had to go back to France to talk to his father and to try to settle his financial affairs. The following years were not easy. John was gone for more than 15 months, and I received very few letters from him during that time. I was only 17, and I was not at all sure John would come back. But when he did come back, he was determined to be successful in business. He first tried to operate a mine at his Mill Grove estate. After a few months, he realized that that was not going to work. Then he moved to New York, and he started working at the counting house of one of my uncles. That really was not John either. So finally, in 1807, John and his partner Rogier went to Kentucky. And when they returned in 1808, 4 years after we first met, I could finally plan my wedding.
Thank you, Lucy. The marriage itself took place April 5th. The very next day, again before the sun, we were up and off on our way to Louisville. The trip itself was rather arduous, at least for some. I enjoyed it tremendously. Lucy may want to tell you something about that, but I want to get us to Louisville and tell you about this wonderful little village we lived in for 2 years. We had many friends there, and it was closer to the wilderness, so I began to see many things that I'd not seen before. But even better, 2 years later, we moved 150 miles farther down the Ohio River to a small village named Henderson. And Henderson was really in the woods. It was in Henderson that I spent 9 of the happiest years of my life, or should I say it was in the woods around Henderson. You see, I had not changed so much after all. I was very fortunate to have a business partner in Ferdinand Rosier. Rosier loved nothing better than to stay behind the counter and count money. And so we had this agreement. He would count the money. I would go out into the woods and shoot the game that would be on our table for dinner that evening. I would be in the woods sometimes for 2 hours, sometimes 6 hours, sometimes 10 hours, and not all of the time hunting, I assure you. So it gave me a wonderful opportunity to see more of the wilderness, to find out more about the birds of America. It was around Henderson then that I became best acquainted with the wild turkey. Now, this is a very intelligent beast. You might be surprised to learn how sensitive these animals are to the approach of man, either red or white. they quickly make a little cluck to each other and they're gone. So you have to be very, very stealthy. They not only are successful at warding off many of their human foes, but they're other predators as well. The snowy owl often tries to dive onto the wild turkey when they're roosting in the lower branches of a large tree. And you would think that the owl, silent, deadly, would have no trouble capturing a turkey. And yet it's just the opposite. Just at the moment when you think that it's about to happen, the owl is seen. One of the turkeys gives a small cluck, and then they are all alert. And at the very moment that the owl comes down, the turkey's head goes down, that tail comes up, and the owl slides down this plane with only a feather or two to show that he's had any success at all. Meanwhile, the turkey drops down on the ground and runs. Have you ever seen a wild turkey run? They are incredibly fast. Many is the time that I have seen someone shoot at a turkey and miss the head or the neck or the upper breast, the only place really where you can kill a wild turkey. And the ball lodges somewhere in the body, and the turkey drops to the ground, and instead of rolling like many animals would, he is off like a flash. And I have seen wild turkeys outrun dogs, horses, men. They are very difficult to catch. But would you like to know how to catch a wild turkey? There is a way. You must think like a turkey, of course. You build a pin, a rectangular pin in the woods, and then you build a little tunnel into the pin, and up inside the pin, you cover the pin, and then you fill the tunnel with corn. And the turkeys, when they're foraging, come upon this corn, and the very first turkey goes, quack, 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 and all the turkeys come running. And they eat all of the corn and just follow it down the path up into the pin, and then they look around. And they see walls, and they look up, and they see it's closed, and they never look down. And there they stay until you come and open up the pen and take them out. So there is a way to catch wild turkeys. And in fact, many is the time when we were in Henderson when the cost of a wild turkey was 1 penny per pound. So Henderson was a wonderful place. I hope that Lucy agrees. Another animal, I wish I had one of my drawings here to show you, was the trumpeter swan. This is one of the largest waterfowls in America. And to see these beautiful birds gliding along the water, you have to be very quiet and very still because they too are very shy. They come and go as a flock, and when you see an entire flock gather itself up and start to beat these huge wings against the water and move off, it takes them maybe 50 yards before they actually leave the water and gracefully ascent into the air. And during that time, the great noise of all of these wings sounds like trumpets of glory. The animal, the trumpeter swan, gets its name from its mouth, from the sound that it makes. But I would almost give it that name from the sound that those great wings make. Henderson was wonderful. I wish sometimes that my life in Henderson could have stayed. And yet, had I done so, I never would have become John James Audubon, the painter. That is a very strange story. But let me wait and tell you more about that. I think Lucy wants to say something about our life in Henderson as well.
At first, I was not at all eager to leave Louisville. Our first son, Victor, was only a few months old, and I had made many friends in Louisville while John was busy working at a store or out in the woods. But after 2 years, we were still living in a tavern and had not been able to buy our own home. John and his partner were quite worried about the store because 4 new stores had opened in Louisville since we moved there 2 years earlier. So they were eager to move on to a new place with less competition. We were all really excited when we read in a newspaper about a new community called Henderson. Let me read to you. The settlement at Henderson, 120 miles down the Ohio on the Kentucky side, recommends itself to newcomers. All is done by plan. The streets are to be 100 feet wide. Space is allotted for a splendid central park, as well as schools and churches. The plan of the town contains 264 lots of 1 acre each. 12 acres in the center of the town are appropriated for public uses. When I was still in England, my father had been really intrigued by the idea of a planned community. So we all decided to move to Henderson. When the 3 of us landed in Henderson, all I could see was a small landing of some great boards. Beyond the landing, a dozen small huts were placed in a small burned-out area. I could not believe that this was Henderson. There were no 100 feet wide streets. There were no streets at all. We moved into the only empty hut, a small windowless cabin consisting of 1 room and a small loft. At first, I was quite shocked, but I was young. We were there, and it was to be our first home. Soon I was busy cleaning and airing the place, setting up Victor's cradle, and opening the crates I had not touched since I had packed them at Fatland Fort. We lived in Henderson for 9 years. During that time, together we climbed many high mountains, but we walked through many low valleys. John drew some of his best works in Henderson, and we met some of our best friends. Our second son, John Woodhouse, I call him Woodhouse because that was the name of our estate in England, was born there. Our 2 little girls, Lucy and Rose, were also born there, but they were only with us for a few years. But I do want to tell you about our first real house, not the little windowless cabin we moved into, but the house we bought in 1812, the house I had dreamed about since I first met John. This was a real house with glass windows and a porch, and in the back there was a wonderful orchard, and I had a beautiful vegetable garden. When the house was ready, we bought a young girl from one of our neighbors who helped me inside. And together, we sewed all the curtains. We started with the flax, and we colored them, and we embroidered them and decorated them. I collected all the furniture. And within a year, we had more books than anybody else in the village. I was finally able to use our wedding silver. And for the first time, I could show people the very delicate china that had been my grandmother's in England. And my pride and joy was the piano that my father shipped down from Fatland Fort. Even though we really lived far away from the old world, our house always reminded me of my life in England. From the beginning, our house was filled with family and friends. My 2 brothers, Tom and William, lived with us. And my younger sister, Eliza, got married in our house. It was very hard to see our house and all our possessions go in 1819 when our businesses failed. But at that time, we made a choice. The children and I went to live with my sister. But John went to Louisville with his portfolio, his gun, and his pencils. And for the first time, he made his living as an artist.
the failure of those businesses saddened me very much, but at the same time, in a certain way, it liberated me. When I went to Louisville, I went there to try to create some more business, but much to my surprise, I was seized by the sheriff and put in jail because my creditors had complained that I had not paid them. And I probably would still be in jail if it weren't for a friend that I found there in the courthouse who showed me how to write a declaration of bankruptcy. I presented this to the judge, who then adjudicated it and allowed me to go free after I'd signed over all of my possessions except for the clothes I was wearing, my gun, and my drawings, which were deemed by the court to be worthless. So, here was an opportunity, if you will look at it that way. The frontier is filled with risks and dangers, and at the same time, adventures and opportunity. Maybe this was an opportunity. I thought about it. What now could I do? I'd always wanted to be a painter. But have you ever heard of a bird paying you for his portrait? It seemed impossible to make a living. And yet, I recalled 1810, back there in Henderson, when one day I was in the store and a very strange-looking Scotsman walked in. He was rather short. His name, you know already, was Alexander Wilson. He brought with him a large collection of drawings of birds and a subscription book. He was seeking subscribers to pay for his Birds of America. I looked at his drawings. I saw that he put the Latin names under these birds. I was very impressed. I picked up my pen to sign as a subscriber when suddenly I heard Rosier, who was standing behind the counter, say to me in French, "Audubon, don't sign. Your drawings are much better than his." And so I looked at it. It was true. I put the pen back down. Wilson seemed to be, shall I say, disappointed. And so he turned to me and asked, "Do you draw?" I went to the cupboard and got out my drawings and showed them to him. He was very impressed. "Do you intend to publish these?" he asked. Well, the thought had never crossed my mind until then. And once it was in my mind, it would not leave. In many ways, I owe Alexander Wilson a great debt for inspiring me in this way. And yet Wilson and I became competitors. I wanted to have a better collection of the birds of America. Already I had more birds drawn than he did. And I wanted to have the most realistic, lifelike birds. His were not as good, or so I thought. And so, with Lucy's encouragement, I began the process of collecting more and more drawings of birds. In 1820, I said goodbye to Lucy and the children, and with a young protege, Joseph Mason, set off by flatboat down the Mississippi River. Eventually, we ended up in New Orleans. And for 4 years, I collected birds and painted portraits and tried to keep my body and soul together while I was making the collection even greater. By 1824, I thought, it's time. I can do it. And again, with Lucy's encouragement, I set off for Philadelphia, a printer's paradise, if I may say, there to find an engraver and begin my collection, my publishing of the Birds of America. Oh, it was a great day when I came to Philadelphia, but the day quickly turned black because it turned out that Philadelphia was the home of George Ord, the publisher of Alexander Wilson's. Yes, right, Alexander Wilson's book. And Ord made sure that I could not find my own publisher in Philadelphia. I was crushed. I wrote to Lucy, I don't know what to do. All our efforts seem at a standstill now. And so even then, John James Audubon, the painter, seemed far off in the distance. Where could I find a publisher? Lucy, bless Lucy, supported me and encouraged me. So once again, with her help, I started saving money so that I could go to England and there find a publisher. I don't want to continue the story too much because I'd rather tell you more about these birds that we have here. But in England, I found 2 engravers, one William Lazar's in Edinburgh, and then after doing 10 of the copper etching plates, he decided that the job was too much for him. And in London, I found Robert Havell Jr. And with the aid of Robert Havell began the enormous process of producing 435 copper plates. I was ecstatic. Finally, I was going to be John James Audubon, the famous painter. But you know, this meant that I had to do everything I could possibly do to find more birds, to paint more birds and get them to Havell so that he could keep putting together the copper plates. So my life was busier than ever. I was in England for over 2 years. In the meantime, writing back and forth to Lucy, I encouraged her to come join me. And she never did. I began to worry why I didn't hear more from her. And a big gap began to grow between us, a gap in some ways similar to the Atlantic Ocean. I'll let her tell part of the story then and see if, or I should say how, we managed to come back together.
After John left in 1826, I was teaching on a plantation in Florida. In Louisiana, I'm sorry. I was in Louisiana. We had worked for 2 years after his return from Philadelphia to collect as much money as we possibly could. And once he left, I faced the unexpected worry of how to collect the substantial amount of tuition that was still owed to us from the last couple of years. When John left to England, he had taken all our savings, and I had very little money left. I had started teaching on the plantation only in 1823, and that was the first time in a long time that our family was living independently and was financially secure. I had just built up credit again in town, and I did not want to go back into debt again, especially since I was not at all sure that John would be successful in England. While I was facing these worries, you can understand how very pleased I was to hear from John that he had received a very warm welcome in Liverpool. Although, of course, I knew very well his tendency to exaggerate, his letters brought tears to my eyes, and I would love to share some with you. Liverpool, 1826. I have many comfortable nights at gentlemen's country seats in the neighborhood, and the style of living is beyond all descriptions. Coaches call for me, and waiters are obedient to me as if I myself was a lord of England. Another one. If I was not dreading to become proud, I would say that I am in Liverpool, a shadow of Lafayette and his welcome in America. When I heard about John's reception in England, I decided to leave the plantation as soon as I could, as soon as I had collected the money, and to go to England with our son Woodhouse the next summer. I was very anxious to be with John, And I was sure that Woodhouse would receive a much better education in England than in Louisiana. John's successes continued as he moved to Edinburgh. Edinburgh, November 1826. My situation in Edinburgh borders almost on the miraculous. Without education, I am positively looked on by all the professors and many of the principal persons as a very extraordinary man. I have come to fine dressing again, silk stockings and pumps. My hairs now are as beautifully long and curly as ever, and I assure thee, do as much for me as my talent of painting. I sent thee a bundle of newspapers published since my arrival. It will surely come as a surprise to some of those around thee to see thy husband spoken of as unrivaled and the foremost ornithologist. I know that I am not as yet secure or wealthy, but I went today and ordered for thee, my sweet, a piano. If only I could sit by thy side playing my flute. At the end of that year, life at the plantation had become very difficult. Over the years, I had several unpleasant discussions with the owner of the plantation, a Scottish widow. She could never understood how John could spend so much time in the woods and how he just could forget his lessons because he had found a new bird or wanted to make another drawing. And she also never understood how I could give all my money and all my earnings to him so that he could go to England with drawings. But since I still did not have any money, I decided to take a position at a different plantation in the neighborhood. At that time, the letters from England brought the good news that John had found a publisher. Then as the months went by, John in his letters talked more and more about himself, about his accomplishments, and about his plans. He seemed to have forgotten that for many years I had supported the family so that he could pursue his dreams. And he certainly had forgotten that I had followed him for over 20 years without any complaints, had lived in poverty, and had been dependent upon the charity of my family because I loved him. And now he complained that we were not together because I wanted a life of comfort. Listen to what he wrote. I may be induced to remain in England the rest of my life, or accidents may send me to America once more. But whatever takes place, and whatever my situation may be hereafter, I have and always will have the consolation to think that I have done all I can, or could since my misfortunes in Kentucky, to restore thee to comfort. The difference of habits between us are very unfortunate, so much indeed that what I conceive real comfort is misery to thee. I have no wish to have thee here, unless thou art convinced of being comfortable in thy own way. And another letter made it very clear to me that John, once again, was not concerned about my difficult financial situation. In this letter, he asked me not to refer again to my troubles with collecting the tuition owed to me, because he liked to share my letters with his wealthy new friends and with their beautiful daughter, Hannah. He writes, "Recollect that they know nothing of our pecuniary situation. Indeed, I believe that everyone who knows me thinks we are very well off. I think it will soon be the case, but in the meantime, Mum, don't talk about it." You can imagine how I felt. At that time, I decided my first priority was to make sure that Woodhouse would receive an education. And I finally had to ask my brother William for a loan for his tuition. When Woodhouse left to go to school in Louisville in the fall of 1828, I was once again in debt, and for the first time in my life, alone at home. During that time, John repeatedly asked me to come to England, but he never sent any money. And I felt that he wanted me to come to help him with his work, not because he loved me. I also felt quite bitter because he kept blaming me for our separation. London, 1828. When I am forced to absent myself, to go after subscribers or to visit some of those whom I already have, thou, being on the spot, would see that no relaxation did take place. 2 heads are better than 1, and I think it would be of great mutual advantage, the ultimate success of my publication. Or, only 5 numbers come out per annum, and that from the beginning to the last of the full completion of the whole, 16 years are wanted. And by January 1828, I will probably have sufficient funds to send for my family. But if thee prefer still to remain longer in America through fear of meeting with disappointments, thou art at full liberty to judge and to act for thyself. When I received this letter, I did not know what to write back. I had so many questions. Could John really stay in England for 16 years without coming for his family? In the past, we had been separated many times, but John had always come back to me. Would he not do the same now if he really loved me? And were the birds no longer our publication? I was very afraid that the birds had become much more important to John than his family. So I wrote to John that if I did decide to leave Louisiana, I would go to Kentucky to the boys in Louisville and wait there for him. Soon I had my answer. The birds had won. London, November 1828. I wrote this day a very long letter to Victor, which will make him open his eyes respecting my publication that you all seem not to know anything correct about. Do, my Lucy, understand me well. My work will not be finished for 14 years to come. And if it is thy intention not to join me before that time, I think we will be better off, both of us, to separate. Thou in America, and I to spend my life most miserably alone for the remainder of my days. The next letter from John came in March of 1829 and contained the very welcome news that he was coming to America. I was very pleased, but I still had my doubts. Was he coming for me, or was he coming to complete his collection? He writes, London, January 1829. I have come to the following conclusions. I will sail for America on April 1st. Though it is very bad and dangerous for me to leave London with all my work unfinished, since I cannot persuade thee to come alone to England, I will come to Philadelphia. It is not my wish to go as far as Louisiana. I must remain close to the coast where I can get word from England should things go wrong. While I wait for thee to join me in Philadelphia, I will journey through nearby Pennsylvania and New Jersey, gathering specimens. I must draw hard from nature all the time I'm in America. And his next letter, which came from New York, read like a letter from a lawyer. It once again stated his belief that I did not want to join him because I was afraid of his financial situation. Then he included a complete accounting of all his assets and debts. And he asked me to make a rational decision. After many sleepless hours, I decided to stay at the plantation in Louisiana. My heart was broken, but I was no longer young and full of dreams. Too many times I had gone to him only to be left again as soon as I arrived. I wrote a short letter to him and explained clearly that his lack of affection and not his financial situation was the reason I decided to stay and wait for him in Louisiana. A letter received by our son Victor at the same time confirmed John's priorities. June 1829, New York. Not a word from you yet, my dear Victor. Where are you? What are you doing? Are you, as your mother seems to be, quite unwilling to believe that I am doing all I can for the best of all of us? Have you thought, as your mother, that although I wrote that I could not go westerly or southerly, that I could undoubtedly do so? If you have, undeceive yourself, and believe me, I cannot go either to Kentucky or Louisiana. I cannot go to her, because was I to lose my summer by so doing, I would miss the birds that I want, and that are not at all to be found west of the mountains. The rest of the story is known. Our dear son Victor convinced his father to come to Louisville, and from there he traveled as quickly as he could to Louisiana. My John described his trip as follows to a friend. November 1829. I reached the home of Mr. N. He lent me his horse, and I went off at a gallop. I was about to rejoin my wife. I was in the woods, and my heart was bursting with joy. At 6 o'clock, I was at Mr. Johnson's house. I went at once to my wife's apartment. Her door was ajar. Already she was dressed and sitting by her piano. I pronounced her name gently, and the next moment I held her in my arms. Tears relieved our hearts. Once more we were together.
And so all of the misunderstandings were resolved. The next dozen years, I worked harder than I have ever worked in my life, traveling up and down the Atlantic coast, finding new birds to send to Havel. I sent my son Victor to be a business manager in London, to keep an eye on Havel, and to make sure that everything was done properly. You see, what I hope you understand, what Lucy found so difficult to understand at that time, was the days when you could have a patron that would support you and just take care of you. Those were all gone. Success was in my hands, but it would slip through my fingers if I was unable to complete the work. And so I was working all the time. Even at my busiest, they were still wonderful years because of meeting so many new birds. My trips to Florida brought me close to the brown pelican, which you see here in front of you. This is a most remarkable bird. If you ever want to have a good weather forecaster, you should consult the brown pelican. They are always by the coast. If they go out to the sea, you know it's going to be a good day without rain, and you too can get in your boat and go out without any worries. But if they stay close to the coast, be careful. They also have an uncanny sense of when the tide changes. I have observed an entire flock of brown pelicans sound asleep as the tide goes out. And then that moment when the tide begins to change and run in, suddenly they all wake up at the same moment, stretch their wings, and off they go fishing. I was the first one to find out that the brown pelican never carries food in its bill. It swallows its food, often whole, and then masticates it in the stomach and brings it back up to feed its children. This is a most remarkable bird and very powerful as well. We have enjoyed our experiences with the brown pelican. Florida also brought me in contact with the wonderful pink flamingo. The great flamingo of Florida is also a very curious bird, and I speak now not only as a painter but as a hunter. The flamingo flies low over the water, but every time he comes to land, he suddenly elevates, and it's very difficult for the hunter to bring him down. These curious-looking birds make their nests on ground, much like you see here that the flamingo is resting on. Often they will choose an island where it's very difficult for people to come and disturb the nests. But the nests are only slightly above the water. And the young flamingos are very, very fragile at first and almost susceptible to any kind of attack until they gain their strength. Did you know that when they are born, they are not pink? They are very white in color. And it's only after they have spent many weeks eating their favorite food, shellfish, that they gain this pink color to them. Most wonderful. My trip to Florida also brought me to Charleston, South Carolina, and there I met a wonderful man who was a friend of Alexander Wilson. So I must pay my respects to Alexander Wilson yet again for, in a way, bringing me in contact with John Bachman. Bachman was a minister, but also a very interested naturalist. In Bachman's home, you could find practically any animal, birds, cats, dogs, and other wild animals who had somehow found their way into living in his home, all competed for a place on the hearth, and often there were big fights from these animals. In Bachman's study, you could from time to time find a porcupine resting, and I hoped that they would only rest and do no more. Bachman was a wonderful man, full of excitement and enthusiasm. We stayed up late at night talking about all kinds of things, and it was from Bachman that I gained the idea. It was his suggestion, really. After much of the great double elephant folio had been completed, it was Bachman's idea that we take on a new project together, the viviparous quadrupeds of America. Ha! So, with Bachman, we traveled up the Missouri River in 1843 and 1844, finding all kinds of new species that could be placed into the viviparous quadrupeds of America. Bachman was a wonderful man. I wrote to him in the late 1830s, you know, for nearly 30 years now, I have labored like a cart horse. And now, do you know what they are calling me? A great naturalist. Success, finally, and comfort, too, for Lucy, had come to us. My travels, the many animals, the gyrfalcon from Iceland. Yes, I wish I would live to be 216 years. I wish I could paint forever. But lately, something is happening to my eyesight. I go to my easel, I put up the canvas, and it blurs. There was a time in 1826, after having left Philadelphia, I journeyed north into New York and there to Niagara Falls. And you know there is a way to walk behind the falls, and I did. Water cascading down. And I could look out, and everything was a blur. And so it becomes now. Wodehouse does much of the painting now. I've turned over everything to him. I still enjoy walking around Minnie's land, the children, the grandchildren. But I miss my birds. I miss my painting. The two great loves of my life. And I fear I say goodbye to one of them.
January 28, 1851. Dear John and Maria, it is over. I have lost my best and dearest friend, my husband of 42 years. John died yesterday, as gently as a child composing himself for his beautiful sleep. He opened his eyes one last time to look at us, and then closed them for eternity. All but the remembrance of him and his goodness to me is gone forever. It is now 3 years since you came to visit us at Minnie's land, when you first saw that his handsome body remained, but his noble mind was all in ruins. During those 3 years, my husband had constant care, often wandering the grounds, led by a grandchild or two. In the evening, he would always ask Victor's wife to sing him that little Spanish lullaby, Buenas noches, and then go gently to bed. Often he would not recognize those people closest to him. But this past fall, my brother William came to visit us. When John saw him, his eyes brightened with a glint of recognition. "Yes, yes, Billy," he cried out. "You go down that side of Long Pond, and I'll go down this side, and we'll get the ducks." His wandering mind had happily alighted on the scene long ago in Henderson, when he and young Billy used to hunt together. These were the last words we heard him speak. May God grant him eternal peace in a world of beautiful birds and loving friends. Yours always, Lucy.
We'd like to close tonight reading you a poem from another Kentuckian, a man who had a particular fondness for John James Audubon. His name was Robert Penn Warren. The poem is from a book that he wrote, a book of poems called Audubon, A Vision. This is the last poem in the book. It's titled, The Sound of That Wind. He walked in the world, knew the lust of the eye, wrote, "Ever since a boy, I have had an astonishing desire to see much of the world and particularly to acquire a true knowledge of the birds of North America. He dreamed of hunting with Boone. From imagination painted his portrait. He proved that the buzzard does not scent its repast, but sights it. He looked in the eye of the wounded white-headed eagle, wrote, "The noble fellow looked at his enemies with a contemptible eye." At dusk, he stood on a bluff, and the bellowing of buffalo was like the distant ocean. He saw bones whiten the plain in the hot daylight.
He saw the Indian and felt the splendor of God. Wrote, "For there I see the man, naked from his hand, and yet free from acquired sorrow."
Below the salt, in rich houses, he sat and knew insult. In the lobbies and couloirs of greatness, he dangled, and was not unacquainted with contumely.
Wrote, "My lovely Miss Perry of Oakley passed by me this morning, but did not remember how beautiful I had rendered her face once by painting it, at her request, with pastels." Wrote, "But thanks to my humble talents, I can run the gauntlet through this world without her help."
And ran it, and ran undistracted by promise of ease, nor even the kind condescension of Daniel Webster. Wrote, "Would give me a fat place, was I willing to have one. But I love independence and peace more than humbug and money." And proved same. But in the end, entered on honor. Far over the ocean, in the silken salons, with hair worn long like a hunter's, eyes shining, he whistled the bird calls of his distant forest.
Wrote, "In my sleep, I continually dream of birds."
And in the end, entered into his urned house and slept in a bed and with Lucy.
But the fiddle soon lay on the shelf, untouched. The mouthpiece of the flute was dry, and his brushes.
His mind was darkened, and his last joy was in the lullaby they sang him in Spanish at sunset. He died and was mourned, who had loved the world.
Who had written, "A world which, though wicked enough, in all conscience is perhaps as good as worlds unknown."
So died in his bed. And night leaned, and now leans off the Atlantic and is on schedule. Grass does not bend beneath that enormous weight that with no sound sweeps westward. In the Mississippi, on a mud bank, the wreck of a great tree, left by flood, lies the root system and now stubbed boughs lifting in darkness. It is white as bone. That whiteness is reflected in dark water and a star thereby.
Later, in the shack of a sheep herder, high above the Bitterroot, the light goes out. No other light is visible.
For everything, there is a season. But there is the dream of a season past all seasons. In such a dream, the wild grape cluster, high hung, exposed in the gold light, unripening, ripens. Stained, the lip with wetness gleams. I see your lip, undrawing, gleam in the bright wind. I cannot hear the sound of that wind. Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, please stay for the birthday cake. Okay, no problem.
Okay. Take your things. Come back later. Oh, let me get your things. What year is it? 1812. A naturalist, an eccentric naturalist, he says, by the name of Constantin Rafinesque, shows up. A strange creature. And Rafinesque is just excited about finding all kinds of new species. So Audubon is showing him a drawing of a bird, and Rafinesque sees in the corner a plant and says, Audubon, that's a new species. I must have that. Show it to me. So immediately they go to find it. That night, Rafinesque is staying in Audubon's house, and after everything seems to be quiet, suddenly Audubon hears this enormous racket coming from upstairs. He goes up to see what is happening, and there's Rafinesque in his nightshirt swinging wildly at these bats that have come in the window. And the object that he's using to swing with is Audubon's favorite violin. And in the process, he ruins the violin. But all he can think of is, Audubon, you must help me catch one of these bats. It's a new species. So Audubon was known, as many people on the frontier, for playing some practical jokes. In turn, I think partly to regain something of his ruined violin, he drew some drawings of very unusual-looking fish and told Rafinesque that these were fish in the Ohio River. Rafinesque believed it, and later it came back to haunt Audubon because he was, years later, attaining a reputation as being a very accurate naturalist. And Rafinesque published his book and said, I have only seen these from a distance, but Monsieur Audubon assures me of their veracity, of their authenticity. So, yeah. Do you know of some stories? Oh, okay. Yeah. Yoka says in her reading she's found that Audubon also played a trick on someone else by telling them that the skunk was a domestic animal and they could just walk right up to it. I haven't found that story yet in my reading, but I would, if I find it, I'll use it.
Did that rat in the pot?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. There were many people in this early part of the 19th century who were excited about the discovery of new species. And, of course, people on the frontier can be forgiven, I guess, for seeing them as rather odd and eccentric. So, again, Yoka reminds that that one of these persons was given a plant in a pot by Audubon with a rat inverted with just the tail sticking up and above the soil, and the man was told that this was a new species of plant. And as weeks went by and the smell became worse, he paid a heavy price. So, yes, I think there were many stories like that. Yes?
What happened to his vision in his mind? Because it was not that old.
Well, To be honest, we don't have a medical answer for you. His granddaughter, Maria, who edited his journals and letters, said it was nothing. It was just, you know, like people growing old, said he could still see well in the distance, but not up close. And that really was not true. You know, the more that I think about it, the more I think, well, then, if that had been the case, he would have put on glasses. But he stopped painting altogether. So I think it was something much greater than that. There's been speculation that this was an onset of syphilis, but there's no evidence for that either. Apparently, he had a stroke in 1847, which is why we put this in 1846. And that stroke crippled his mind, and then things just started to unwind. That's the best I know.
When he was a boy at Mill Pond,
Mill Grove.
was he with his parents at early time?
No, his parents stayed in France. The captain, if I recall, never visited Mill Grove again after the boy, John, was there. He was there primarily to stay alive, to avoid service in the Napoleonic Wars. But then also, his father hoped that this boy, who had been extremely spoiled by his stepmother in France, that's where he really gained his enjoyment of birds. They lived near the mouth of the Loire River, and he would go out into the estuary and spend days just. She would pack him a lunch, and the lunch pail would come back with birds' eggs and all kinds of, you know, what a boy does. So in Mill Grove, even though his father hoped that John would now sort of grow up, there was a lead mine on the property, and the idea was that John would become this businessman who would support the excavation of the mine. It didn't happen. John just had no interest in that at all. I wonder, when he decided that he wanted to marry Lucy, he had to go back to France to convince his father. He went back to France, tried to convince his father, and I don't think his father was really convinced. A year passed. A year at the very time when young men are being drafted into Napoleon's army, and Audubon is drawing birds and I mean, just sort of taking on his young childhood once again. And I think that finally his father said, I've got to do something about this boy. He's not doing it for himself. So he links him up with this Ferdinand Rosier character and sends them both back to America, forging passports for them in order to get them out of the country. The story is that the customs officer who saw them go handed the passport back to Audubon and said, "Oh, I wish I could have a passport like that." So, did I answer your question? I don't know.
I was interested in his love of birds, and started at a very, very early age, and his ability to draw was at an early age.
Yes, his stepmother encouraged his drawing. Later, I think, at some time when he was at Mill Grove, he looked at those drawings, or I guess it was when he came back to France, he looked at the drawings and thought they were very rudimentary and destroyed them all. And indeed, in much of his life, he was frequently destroying the earlier works, trying to make better. He was always trying to improve.
Did he have any formal education? I don't recall you saying that he went to school anywhere.
Well, these romps through the Loire estuary were often playing hooky from school. So he often missed school there. His father had gone away on a voyage and come back and asked asked what he had learned at school, and well, he hadn't been in school very much. His mother allowed this, and then asked him to play his violin to show that he'd been taking violin lessons, and the violin was unstrung. Obviously, it hadn't been used very much either. And so the father didn't say anything that night, but the next morning he got Audubon up at the crack of dawn and took him to military academy. And the young John Audubon then thought, I'm not sure I want to be here. And so tumbled out the window and started to go off into the woods again. Well, he'd been spotted. He was, shall I say, arrested in a kind way and taken to a boat out in the harbor, which was the prison. And his father had to go and take him out of prison. So it was just a constant problem for his father. How am I going to get this boy to grow up? And finally, I think it was not so much that he hoped that John really would grow up, but he just wanted to make sure he didn't die in the war, that he sent him to America.
So he really didn't have much in the way of formal schooling?
No, Audubon claimed at one time that he had received drawing lessons in the studio of Jacques-Louis David, the famous revolutionary painter. And some of his biographers go along with that, and others are very doubtful.
Did I read that someone else did the backgrounds, the various...
Usually he hired someone else to do the backgrounds. The young boy, Joseph Mason, that he went down the Mississippi River with, was really excellent at drawing flowers and plants. And later he hired other people. And when he was so very busy drawing these birds, he would send sort of incomplete paintings to the engraver Havel and say, you fill in the background. And that's what happened. Is it here? Oh, no, I guess not. It's in another painting that I thought was up here. I was going to give you an example.
Can you identify, for example, whether certain ones were Masons, or, I mean, did Mason ever become a famous painter?
Mason was very good, but he and Audubon had a falling out because Mason wanted some credit. And Audubon, if you will look at any of these, they all say drawn by J.J. Audubon, FRS, LSA, or something like that. So finally Mason said, I just can't do this. He parted with Audubon and went back to, I believe, Cincinnati, and there worked for a museum for the rest of his life. Never received that real breakthrough. And what made Audubon so special was life-size and very natural-looking birds. And then what he added to that was a lifetime of the knowledge of the naturalist of just how these birds looked and acted, and times when they were at war with each other or fighting. He has marvelous paintings that describe scenes that I think very few people have seen. Charles Darwin, in his Origin of Species, quotes Audubon over 20 times, using Audubon as the source for many important observations. So it's that combination of the marvelous artist plus the very observant naturalist.
Yeah. Wasn't there a text that accompanied each of the paintings?
The 435 engravings that became the double elephant portfolio, the Birds of America, had no text. Although Audubon wished there would be a text, but had he included a text with the first edition, the law in England said you had to give a free copy of every textual item to each library in England. It would have cost him enormously. It would have hit really undercut his profits. So once that was out of the way, he began work on what he called the ornithological biography of birds. And there was the text in a separate book that wasn't so expensive to accompany the elephant folio.
Was the English bird artist Gould a contemporary of Audubon, or did he come later?
I don't know. I don't think I've run into that, but I haven't paid that much attention in trying to get my story of Audubon together. But I was looking at just today at his English experience and some of the artists that he talked about. John Symes, for example, the man who painted his portrait in 1826. I don't remember seeing the name of Gould.
I can't remember the years of Gould. I've seen his work, but I can't remember his dates.
What did happen to his father's fortune?
Well, you see, there's this story about the birth of John James Audubon. And the way that happens is Audubon's father was married to this woman in France. Audubon himself was born on the island of Haiti, or Santo Domingo. And I guess the biographers are now believe that Audubon's mother was a French chambermaid that was on the same boat as her father on this trip. But then Audubon had a half-sister by another woman in Haiti. And or at least that's the interpretation. Audubon himself played with the wish, perhaps, that he was the lost Dauphin. That at approximately the same time he was born, Louis XVI had a son born, and that son disappeared in the Revolution. Last year, using DNA sampling, scientists were able to show that that son, the lost Dauphin, died in prison in the Bastille. So we know now he's definitely not, although he never knew for sure and always was sort of intrigued by this. So with this kind of what do I call it? Inheritance, that's the wrong word, patronage, it was unclear how much he should inherit, and other relatives contested the will. And eventually, he ended up getting nothing. But by that time, he didn't need it. So it wasn't quite as drastic as you might think. Yeah.
You left your wife at home for many years. Were you a rape or roué, as we say?
Well, those kinds of things don't really get written about. So it would be hard to say. I think the characterization we've tried to produce is an accurate one, that Audubon was actually very shy and mostly interested in birds, but he thought himself very handsome. And I think one of the horrible things is that when he's in New Orleans and poor Lucy is up here in Louisville, or I'm sorry, in Henderson, already working very hard, he writes this long letter about his encounter with a naked woman in New Orleans who wants him to paint her portrait. And it's filled with her almost aggressive character and his shy blushing. And I can just imagine, what would you think if you were this man's wife and he sent you this information?
But he wrote everything to Lucy. I mean, his letters are just, he doesn't hide anything. He's very explicit, and he pours out his heart. So that's very amazing. But she was left so many times, he found her a job as soon as he asked her to come and join him. He found her a job. And then he left.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's good.
Oh, that's a beautiful cake.
Here comes the cake. Thank you very much. I think they were apart most of their lives. Most of their married life, they were apart because, as Lucy seemed to indicate, like as soon as they came together, he was off. Yeah, more trips, finding more birds. Right. That was his love and that was his life. There's one quote that I wish we had pulled in. Lucy wrote to a cousin soon after they were in Henderson, where she said, "I have a rival in every bird."
She lived 20 more years than he
The
did.
Life of Audubon would make such a splendid movie, such an epic
Yes.
movie.
Oh,
I always thought it would be cast with, I was trying to think of who would play Audubon, and the nearest I've come up with is Daniel Day-Lewis.
oh, he'd be wonderful.
Yes, with all that wonderful long
Yes,
nose, or
yes,
so handsome,
and a long
French
nose.
accent.
Yes.
I think it would be a great story. I'm surprised nobody's ever done it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
America and Paris, and it would be the most great locales, and could show them in studio doing it. There's just lots of, meat for that kind of thing.
And then we could have The Naked Lady. It would be a big hit.
Oh, his letters are so beautiful and poetic.
Yes, they are.
And, they could use, I just think that someone should do it. Audubon.
Yeah.
Well, didn't he have a reputation as being a very beautiful dancer?
Yeah.
Oh, remarkable. Yeah.
So that would be a great story.
Peggy and I have always imagined.
Oh, I think it's a great idea.
Good idea.
Yeah. Well, how do we make that happen?
I know. Who can be interested in it without stealing our ideas?
Are there actually complete portfolios in one collection, or have they been all broken up?
There are a number of editions that are complete. But when you say that, I recall Audubon's great dismay that one of his subscribers used it to wallpaper her house.
It's now the most expensive natural history book in the world.
Is it really? Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, it's
Spend an evening with the Audubons.
thanks for being an audience. It's just wonderful to share it. Oh, great.
Well, he must have been a real woodsman and an incredible hunter to be able to, not just to observe, but to obtain the animals. I mean, he must have been just an incredible person in the woods.
He, some of those times when he was having trouble surviving, he hired himself out as a hunter to parties to feed them. So he really was a crack shot. Yeah, yeah. And like Lucy said, he had energy you just couldn't believe. He would often work, 17-hour days working in the Louisiana swamps when people just got completely exhausted by the middle of the afternoon. And somehow he just went right through it.
Well, with mosquitoes and snakes. And
Yes.
We grew up in
Yeah.
Florida, so we know and I used to hunt in Florida, so I can imagine him out there traipsing around like that, drawing birds.
You can imagine better than I can. Be crazy.
So clearly he was a really exceptional and unusual person, and people really didn't quite know what to make of him. And that's why there wouldn't be a lot of descriptions of him, because people would be at a loss, really, to represent him.
Yeah. As Yoka pointed out, as Lucy, here was this man who was the best of everything and yet dressed like a dandy, and what could you make of him? Yeah. And Victor Nolte tells the story of running into Audubon on a boat going down from Pittsburgh down the Ohio River. And he heard Audubon's voice, didn't know